Emily's fingers gripped the steering wheel as she drove down the narrow, winding road cutting through the dense, unforgiving forest of rural Scotland. The moon was nothing more than a sliver in the sky, barely illuminating the world around her. The tall pines loomed like silent sentinels, their shadows long and twisted, stretching out onto the road like bony fingers reaching for something or someone. The radio crackled with static, and Emily reached over to turn it off, shuddering at the sudden silence that filled the car. She was miles from the nearest town, and the idea of being alone in the middle of nowhere had started to gnaw at her nerves. But she was almost there, almost at the cabin her friend had told her about, a supposed retreat from the hustle and bustle of city life. A dark figure darted out onto the road ahead. Emily slammed on the brakes, her heart leaping into her throat. The car screeched to a halt, tires skidding on the gravel. She strained her eyes to see what it was, but the shadows seemed to swallow it whole. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts as she stared into the abyss before her, and then nothing, no movement, no sound. With trembling hands, she tried to restart the car, but the engine only groaned in protest. She tried again, nothing. The headlights flickered, and then, with a disheartening click, they went out completely, plunging her into darkness. "Shit," she muttered under her breath, hitting the steering wheel in frustration. She reached for her phone, but of course there was no signal. There never was when you really needed it. As she sat there, the darkness seemed to press in on her, thick and suffocating. Then she heard it. A faint rustling sound, like leaves being disturbed. Emily froze, her ears straining to catch any other noises. A soft giggle floated through the night, high-pitched and unnatural. Her blood ran cold. She turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the tree line just beyond the road. There, amidst the trees, she could see them. Shadows flitting between the trunks, too quick to make out, but there. Watching. Waiting. No. She whispered to herself, trying to shake off the rising panic. It's just the wind, just my imagination. But the sound of laughter, a chorus of it now, mingling with whispers, grew louder, closer. She grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment, its metal cold against her skin, and opened the car door with a creak that echoed through the night. Stepping out, the air was cold and sharp, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. She pointed the flashlight toward the trees, the beam slicing through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. Just the endless rows of trees standing tall and still. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky, barely a whisper. But she didn't want an answer. Not really. She took a step forward, then another, the gravel crunching under her boots. The whispers seemed to beckon her, drawing her into the forest. And despite every instinct screaming at her to stay by the car, she moved toward the tree line, her heart pounding in her chest. The flashlight flickered, casting eerie, dancing shadows as she ventured deeper into the woods. The trees closed in around her, the canopy above blocking out what little moonlight there was. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence that made her skin prickle with unease. She stopped, realizing she was now surrounded by the forest, the road and her car lost somewhere behind her. She turned in a slow circle, the beam of her flashlight darting from tree to tree, searching for anything, anyone. "Who's there?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. A twig snapped behind her and she spun around, the flashlight illuminating a figure standing just at the edge of the beam's reach. It was the silhouette of a person, unmoving, watching her with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. "Stay away!" she shouted, taking a step back, but the figure didn't move. It simply stood there like a statue carved out of the night itself. The light flickered again, and when it steadied, the figure was gone. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she turned wildly, the light now revealing several figures around her, all with the same glowing eyes, their faces obscured by shadow. She screamed and broke into a run, her feet slipping on the damp leaves as she crashed through the underbrush. The flashlight beam jerked wildly, casting monstrous shadows as she sprinted blindly through the trees. The whispers had returned, louder now, as if they were right beside her, inside her head. Suddenly the ground disappeared beneath her feet. She tumbled down a steep embankment, her body slamming into the earth, rocks tearing at her clothes and skin. The flashlight flew from her hand and shattered against a tree trunk, plunging her into complete darkness. Emily lay there gasping for breath, her body throbbing with pain. She could hear them moving closer, the whispers now a cacophony surrounding her. With a final, desperate burst of energy, she pushed herself to her feet, but it was too late. The figures were there, just beyond the edge of her vision, closing in. She tried to scream, but the sound was choked off as a cold hand wrapped around her throat, pulling her down into the darkness. The last thing Emily heard was the sound of laughter echoing through the trees as everything faded to black.
Michael loved trains, the rhythmic chugging, the whistle's mournful cry, the promise of distant lands. Ever since he was a child, the sight of a train would fill him with a sense of wonder and adventure. He would spend hours at the local station, watching the trains come and go, imagining the stories of the passengers and the places they were headed, yet standing before this particular train, his heart pounded a discordant rhythm. It was unlike any train he had ever seen. There was something almost sentient about it, as if it were watching him, waiting for him to make a move. It was old, a relic from a bygone era, its paint peeled like sunburned skin, revealing rusted scars beneath. The train seemed to carry the weight of countless journeys, each layer of rust and peeling paint telling a story of its own. This train, his boss had said, needed to be moved. A simple task, ferrying it from its dusty siding to the workshops a few miles down the line. Michael had done this countless times before, but something about this train made him uneasy. But the way the setting sun cast long skeletal shadows from the train car couplings unsettled Michael. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, creating eerie shapes that danced in the fading light. He shook off the feeling, attributing it to the encroaching twilight. He was a man of iron and steam, not shadows and whispers. He had faced many challenges in his career, and he wasn't about to let a few shadows get the better of him. He climbed into the engine car, the metal cold and damp beneath his touch. The interior was just as aged and worn as the exterior, with levers and gauges that looked like they hadn't been used in decades. The air hung heavy, thick with the smell of oil and dust and something else, something unnameable. It was a scent that seemed to cling to the very walls of the train, a reminder of its long and storied past. He threw a lever, the engine coughing and sputtering before roaring to life. The sound was a familiar one, but in this context it felt different. It was as if the train was waking from a long slumber, reluctant to return to the world of the living. The sound, usually a comfort, echoed strangely in this forgotten corner of the rail yard. The echoes seemed to bounce off the abandoned buildings, creating a haunting symphony that sent chills down Michael's spine. As the train lurched forward, a shiver ran down Michael's spine. He had driven many trains in his life, but this one felt different. It was as if the train had a mind of its own, guiding him rather than the other way around. He pushed it aside, focusing on the tracks ahead. He had a job to do. The tracks stretched out before him, leading into the unknown. He reminded himself that he was a professional and he couldn't let his imagination get the better of him. But the feeling persisted, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. Every creak and groan of the train seemed amplified, each sound adding to his growing sense of dread. This was no ordinary train, this was something else, something haunted. The thought lingered in his mind, refusing to be dismissed. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone, that the train itself was alive, watching and waiting. The train groaned and creaked, a symphony of age and decay. Each shudder sent shivers down Michael's spine. He gripped the controls, his knuckles white. The air grew colder, the scent of oil turning rancid, mixed with the faintest hint of decay. Outside, the landscape blurred into a canvas of muted greens and browns. The setting sun cast long, grotesque shadows that danced alongside the train. He tried to focus on the rhythm of the wheels against the tracks, but another sound intruded, a faint whispering, like wind through dry leaves. He glanced at the passenger cars trailing behind. Their windows, caked in grime, stared back like vacant eyes. The whispers seemed to emanate from within, growing louder, more insistent. He shook his head, his pulse quickening. It was just the wind, he told himself, just the wind. But deep down, a primal fear began to stir. The whispers were growing louder, morphing into hushed voices, indistinguishable words swirling around him. He felt a presence, cold and unseen, watching him from the shadows of the empty carriages. He tried to rationalize the strange occurrences. Every creak, every whisper, every flicker of light had to have a logical explanation. He was determined to find it. The whispers were just the wind whistling through gaps in the old carriages. The sound, though eerie, was nothing more than air finding its way through the cracks and crevices of the ancient train, the shadows merely tricks of the fading light. As the train moved, the dim lights flickered, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. He clung to logic, a lifeline in the growing darkness. His grip on reality was firm, or so he tried to convince himself. The rational mind was his anchor, his shield against the encroaching fear. He focused on the track ahead, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a grounding presence. The steady, predictable sound was a reminder of the physical world, a world governed by laws and reason. He told himself that he was simply tired, his senses heightened by the solitude and the encroaching night. Fatigue played tricks on the mind, he knew that. It was a simple explanation for the strange sensations he was experiencing. There was no need for alarm. He was in control, a master of his own mind. The darkness was just that. Darkness. It held no power over him. He was a man of science, of reason. His life was built on facts, on evidence. Superstitions and ghost stories had no place in his world. Ghosts and spirits were for campfire stories, not for grimy train cabins. The very idea was laughable, a relic of a less enlightened time. He reached for his thermos, the metal icy cold against his palm. The chill was a welcome sensation, a reminder of the tangible, the real. The coffee inside was lukewarm and bitter, but it provided a small comfort. The familiar taste grounded him, brought him back to the present. He took a long sip, willing his heart rate to slow. The warmth spread through him, a counter to the cold fear that threatened to take hold. He just needed to deliver this train to the workshops. Then he could be done with it. The task was simple, straightforward. It was a job, nothing more. Done with the whispers, the shadows, the unsettling feeling of being watched. He longed for the moment he could step off the train and leave the strange occurrences behind. But even as he tried to convince himself, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. What if there was more to it? What if the shadows held secrets he couldn't explain? The whispers were getting louder, the shadows more defined. They seemed to take on shapes, forms that defied logic and reason. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone on this train. The sensation of being watched was growing stronger, more insistent. Something else was with him, something ancient and malevolent. The presence was palpable, a dark force that seemed to seep into the very fabric of the train. He steeled himself, drawing on every ounce of his rational mind. He would not succumb to fear. He would face whatever was in the shadows with the strength of his reason. Step by step, he moved through the train, each footfall a testament to his resolve. He would uncover the truth, no matter how unsettling it might be. He reached for the light switch, his hand trembling slightly. Light would dispel the shadows, reveal the reality behind the fear. As the light flooded the carriage, the shadows retreated and the whispers faded. The train was just a train, the darkness just an absence of light. He took a deep breath, the tension easing from his shoulders. The logic of shadows had held, and he had emerged victorious. The train arrived at the workshop, and he stepped off, leaving the eerie journey behind. The night had tested him, but he had held firm to his reason. As he walked away, he glanced back at the train, a small smile playing on his lips. The shadows had been just that, shadows, and he had faced them with the unwavering light of logic. The train rattled on, the rhythmic chugging of the engine a counterpoint to the whispers that now seemed to emanate from the very walls of the cabin. The night was thick with fog, shrouding the train in an almost otherworldly mist. Each chug of the engine seemed to echo through the dense air, creating a symphony of mechanical and spectral sounds. He could feel a presence behind him, cold and ethereal, brushing against his neck like a phantom's breath. The sensation was unnerving, sending shivers down his spine. It was as if the very air around him had turned into a ghostly entity, whispering secrets of the past. He risked a glance over his shoulder, his heart pounding in his chest. The dim light cast long shadows, making every corner of the cabin seem alive with unseen entities. His breath hitched as he scanned the area, half expecting to see a spectral figure looming behind him. The cabin was empty, bathed in the eerie orange glow of the single lantern overhead. The flickering light created an unsettling dance of shadows, making the emptiness feel even more oppressive. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the train's wooden frame, but the feeling persisted, the sensation of unseen eyes boring into him. It was as if the very walls of the cabin were watching him, judging him. His eyes darted around, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing this eerie feeling. He turned back, his grip on the controls tightening. The levers felt cold and unyielding under his fingers, a stark contrast to the warmth of his own skin. He tried to focus on the task at hand, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. The train lurched suddenly, throwing him against the side of the cabin. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and he struggled to regain his footing. The train's unpredictable movements added to the growing sense of dread. He swore under his breath, his eyes darting to the gauges. The dials and meters seemed to mock him with their steady readings, as if nothing was amiss. Yet the erratic behavior of the train told a different story. Everything seemed to be in order. The gauges showed normal readings, but he knew better. The train's behavior was anything but normal, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. But the train was behaving erratically, speeding up, slowing down, as if controlled by an unseen hand. It was as if the train had a mind of its own, playing a sinister game with him. The unpredictability of its movements made him feel even more helpless. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, his fear morphing into a cold dread. The sweat felt icy against his skin, a stark reminder of the unnatural cold that permeated the cabin. His mind raced with thoughts of what could be causing this. He was not in control. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He was merely a pawn in whatever game was being played. The controls that once felt familiar now seemed foreign and unresponsive. Something else was driving this train, something that lurked in the shadows, toying with him. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, creating shapes and figures that danced at the edge of his vision. He felt a growing sense of panic, knowing that he was not alone. He was just a passenger, trapped in a nightmare ride from which there seemed no escape. The train's relentless journey through the foggy night felt like a descent into madness. He could only hope that this phantom ride would end soon, but deep down, he feared it never would.
Adam thrived in the darkness. 14 years he had spent working the graveyard shift in museums, surrounded by echoes of the past. He knew the rhythm of the night, the way shadows danced in the moonlight. Each night was a journey through history, a solitary exploration of forgotten stories. But nothing in his years of experience had prepared him for this. The museum was a labyrinth of shadowy corridors and towering exhibits. Adam patrolled the halls, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble floors. He paused at the entrance to the Egyptian exhibit, a shiver crawling down his spine. The hieroglyphs lining the sarcophagi seemed to writhe and shift, their ancient power palpable. He moved on, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but the feeling of unease persisted, clinging to him like cobwebs. The silence, once a comfort, now felt oppressive. It was as if the very walls were listening, waiting for him to let down his guard. Something about this museum chipped away at his certainty, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. Two weeks of unsettling quiet, fleeting shadows, and a growing sense of dread. He'd been hired for his experience, but nothing had prepared him for this. It started subtly, a flicker at the edge of his vision, a whisper that vanished quickly. As the days turned into nights, the incidents became more frequent. The shadows grew bolder, lingering in doorways, darting behind pillars. The whispers morphed into distinct sounds, a soft sigh, a muffled laugh, footsteps echoing through empty corridors. He started to feel a presence, unseen but palpable, following him. Adam had always dismissed supernatural tales as folklore. Now he wasn't so sure. It began simply, a flicker at the edge of his vision. Easy to dismiss as fatigue, but Adam knew the difference. There was a rhythm to the night, a predictable dance of light and shadow. This was something else. He found himself pausing more often, his gaze sweeping across the darkened exhibits. The feeling lingered, a prickle on the back of his neck, the unsettling sensation of being watched. The silence seemed to amplify every creak and groan of the old building. He chided himself for acting like a rookie. This was just a job, a paycheck. The flicker persisted, growing bolder each night. It began to intrude, a fleeting darkness darting across the walls. At first Adam tried to ignore it, telling himself it was a moth, a bat, but deep down a primal fear took root. One night he swore he saw it again, a shadow slipping behind a statue. He froze, his heart pounding, but found nothing. He forced a laugh, a nervous expulsion of air that did little to ease the tension. By the fifth night, the flicker had morphed into a full-fledged shadow. Adam, his nerves frayed, decided to confront it. Near the medieval armory he saw it, a tall, indistinct shape lurking in the shadows. "All right, that's enough," he muttered, stepping closer. "I don't know what you are, but this game is over." The shadow didn't move, remaining perfectly still. Adam, his heart hammering, took another step, raising the flashlight like a weapon. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but dust motes. Adam felt a chill run down his spine. He was alone. Or was he? The feeling of being watched intensified, prickling at the hairs on the back of his neck. He spun around, flashlight beam sweeping across the armory. Empty suits of armor stared back at him. He could have sworn he felt a breath on his neck, cold and fetid. His pulse quickened. He needed to get a grip. Adam found himself drawn to the Egyptian exhibit. It was the oldest, most unsettling part of the museum. He hated the way the air felt heavy, thick with the scent of dust and decay. And most of all, he hated the obsidian amulet. Carved from a single piece of obsidian, it depicted a scarab beetle. But it was the energy emanating from the amulet that unsettled Adam. It was as if the amulet held a consciousness, a malevolent intelligence that watched and waited. Tonight, Adam had come prepared with his trusty flask of whiskey. He knew it was foolish, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. He took a long swig, feeling his anxiety lessen. "All right, you ancient relic," he muttered, staring down at the obsidian amulet. He spent hours pacing around the Egyptian exhibit, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The silence was unnerving, broken only by his own breathing. He was starting to think he was wasting his time when he heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible above his heartbeat. He froze, his flashlight beam wavering. He strained his ears, listening for any repetition of the sound. Silence. He was about to dismiss it when he heard it again, a whisper, soft and sibilant. It was a language he didn't recognize, sending chills down his spine. He shone his flashlight around the exhibit, but there was nothing there. And then, the lights flickered, and the museum was plunged into darkness. "Shit," Adam cursed, fumbling for his flashlight. The whispering grew louder, swirling around him. He had to get out of there. Panic swelled in Adam's chest. The whispers intensified, morphing into a low, guttural chant. He couldn't understand the words, but he could feel their malevolent intent. He backed away slowly, his heart pounding. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. His breath caught in his throat, every instinct screaming at him to run. He remembered the layout of the museum, the emergency exits, but fear drove him deeper into the darkness. He stumbled over something hard and metallic. He shone his flashlight down, realizing he was beside the empty pedestal where the amulet had been displayed. The case was empty. The obsidian amulet was gone. It wasn't just an object, it was something alive, something malevolent. He needed to get out, to call for help. But the whispers, now a cacophony of sound, seemed to press in on him, urging him forward, deeper into the labyrinthine corridors of the museum. He was no longer in control of his own actions, his body moving on instinct, driven by a fear so profound it bordered on madness. He stumbled through the darkness, his flashlight beam a beacon of futility in the overwhelming blackness. The air grew thick and heavy, filled with the scent of dust and decay, a suffocating miasma that seemed to cling to his lungs, stealing his breath. He could feel the whispers closing in around him, pressing against his skin like icy fingers, their voices growing louder, more insistent. The chanting had become a chorus, a symphony of shadows and whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Panic threatened to overwhelm him. He was trapped, hunted by something he couldn't see, couldn't understand. His flashlight beam darted frantically across the darkness, illuminating nothing but empty hallways and the occasional glint of glass from a display case. He was lost, disoriented, his senses overloaded by the oppressive darkness, the suffocating air, the relentless chanting that seemed to be closing in on him like a tightening noose. And then, through the darkness and the fear, he saw it. A faint light flickering like a candle flame at the end of the corridor. Hope surged through him, a lifeline in the sea of darkness. He stumbled towards it, his pace quickening, his fear momentarily forgotten in the desperate need to escape. As he drew closer, the light grew stronger, revealing the outline of a doorway, an archway leading into another part of the museum. He didn't recognize this section, but it didn't matter. All he cared about was getting out of the darkness, away from the whispers that seemed to be clawing at his sanity. He was almost to the doorway when the light flickered once and died, plunging him back into absolute darkness. A strangled cry escaped his lips as he stumbled to a halt, his hand flying out to brace himself against the wall. And that's when he saw it. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light filtering in from the hallway beyond, was a figure. Tall, skeletal, its form shrouded in what appeared to be tattered robes. 2 points of light burned within the depths of its hood, like embers in the darkness. Adam froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The chanting stopped. An unnerving silence descended, broken only by the frantic pounding of his own heart. He stared at the figure, unable to move, unable to breathe. It was as if time itself had ground to a halt, every detail of that moment etched into his memory with terrifying clarity. The figure's stillness, the way it seemed to absorb the surrounding light, the 2 burning embers that locked onto his gaze with an intensity that seemed to pierce his very soul. He couldn't tell how long they stood there, locked in that silent confrontation. It felt like an eternity, a timeless void where fear was the only constant. Then, as slowly and deliberately as it had appeared, the figure began to move towards him. 1 step, 2. Each movement was agonizingly slow, measured, as if the figure was savoring Adam's terror, drawing it out, prolonging the moment. The air grew colder, the scent of decay stronger, until it felt like a physical presence, suffocating him, pressing down on him. Just as the figure was a step away, a hair's breadth from reaching him, the lights flickered back on. The sudden illumination was blinding. Adam blinked rapidly, his eyes struggling to adjust. He looked back to the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure was gone. The sudden return of light was like a physical blow. Adam reeled, his eyes stinging, his breath caught in his throat. The hallway stretched before him, empty, illuminated by the harsh glare of the emergency lights. The chanting had ceased, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy, pregnant with unseen menace. He didn't hesitate, didn't waste a single second trying to rationalize what he'd seen. His body, fueled by adrenaline and raw terror, took over. He turned and fled, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble floor, the sound bouncing off the walls like the frantic beat of a drum. He didn't look back, didn't dare to see if the figure was following him. His lungs burned, his legs screamed for respite, but still he ran. The museum, once a place of wonder and intrigue, had transformed into a nightmare, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers that he was desperate to escape. He careened around corners, his flashlight beam a jittery beacon in the darkness, his mind a chaotic jumble of fear and adrenaline. The emergency exit seemed miles away, each corridor stretching endlessly before him, twisting and turning in a disorienting dance of shadows and light. The night air hit him like a slap, cold, crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain and something else, something ancient and unsettling that clung to the back of his throat like bile. He stumbled out of the museum, his chest heaving, his legs shaky beneath him. He didn't stop running until he reached the street, the harsh glare of the streetlights momentarily blinding him. The city, usually a symphony of noise and light, seemed strangely muted, as if holding its breath, observing him from a distance. He glanced back at the museum, its imposing facade looming over the street, its windows dark and lifeless. From this distance it seemed almost peaceful, a silent sentinel guarding its secrets. But Adam knew better. He had looked into the heart of that silence, had felt the icy breath of something ancient and malevolent. He stood there for a long moment, catching his breath, trying to slow the frantic beating of his heart. The events of the night replayed in his mind, a terrifying montage of shadows, whispers, and that final, chilling encounter in the darkened doorway. He reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. He needed to call someone, tell someone what had happened, but who would believe him? Who would understand? He was just a night watchman, a nobody paid to sit in the dark and pretend to guard against the impossible. He looked back at the museum, a shiver running down his spine. He could almost feel its gaze upon him, cold and calculating, as if daring him to return, to test its boundaries once more. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he would never be free of this place, that it had sunk its claws into him, marked him as its own. He thought about the amulet, the obsidian scarab beetle with its outstretched wings. Was it merely an object, a conduit for some unseen force? Or was it something more, something alive, something malevolent that had chosen him, singled him out for its own twisted purposes? He didn't know the answers, and for the first time in his life he didn't want to know. Some things, he realized, were best left buried in the darkness, locked away in the silent tombs of history. Adam turned and walked away from the museum, his steps slow at first, hesitant then gradually gaining purpose. He didn't know where he was going, what he would do next, but one thing was certain: he would never set foot inside that building again. He had looked into the abyss, had felt the icy breath of something ancient and evil, and it had changed him. He was no longer the man he had been, the skeptic who dismissed the whispers of the night as mere superstition. He had seen the truth, had felt its touch, and it had left an indelible mark on his soul. As he walked, he could feel the city watching him, its lights seeming to flicker and dim as he passed. He was a stranger in a familiar land, marked by his encounter with the darkness, forever changed by the whispers that echoed in the silence of his mind. The museum stood silent, its secrets locked away once more. But the silence was different now. It was no longer empty, expectant. It was a silence filled with the knowledge of what had transpired, of the terror that had unfolded within its walls. It was a silence that held its breath, waiting, watching, for the next unsuspecting soul to cross its threshold and awaken the darkness within.
Anneliese Michel. A name whispered in hushed tones, a name synonymous with horror. She was a young girl from Germany, a devout Catholic. Her life, once filled with promise, took a sinister turn at the tender age of 16. Anneliese began experiencing strange occurrences. Visions plagued her, voices whispered in her ear, tormenting her with unholy pronouncements. Doctors, baffled by her condition, offered a clinical diagnosis: epilepsy. Medication was prescribed, but it provided no solace. Annalisa knew deep in her soul that this was no ordinary ailment. This is the story of Annalisa Michel. At first, the voices were faint, a mere whisper at the edge of hearing. Annalisa would brush them off, attributing them to an overactive imagination. But the whispers persisted, growing louder, more insistent with each passing day. They taunted her, mocked her faith, and filled her dreams with unspeakable horrors. The visions began subtly as well, fleeting shadows that danced at the periphery of her vision. But soon the shadows took on more sinister forms. Grotesque faces with eyes that burned like hot coals leered at her from the darkness. Annalisa, a devout Catholic, clung to her faith, seeking solace in prayer. She could feel a presence within her, a darkness that was slowly consuming her soul. The seizures began suddenly, racking her young body with violent convulsions. Doctors diagnosed her with epilepsy. Annalisa was prescribed a cocktail of drugs, each one designed to quell the seizures. But the pills brought no relief. The seizures continued, each one seemingly more violent than the last. And worse, the voices, the visions, they remained, undeterred by the pharmaceuticals meant to banish them. Her parents, though devout in their faith, were torn. They clung to the hope that the doctors were right. But as the weeks turned into months and Annalisa's condition worsened, doubt began to creep into their hearts. Annalisa herself never doubted the nature of her affliction. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she was possessed. Annalisa's once vibrant life, filled with the simple joys of youth, was now consumed by darkness. She withdrew from her friends, her laughter silenced by the constant torment that raged within her. Her grades, once exemplary, plummeted as she struggled to focus on anything but the chilling reality of her possession. Her family, once a beacon of warmth and love, was slowly being torn apart by the strain of her condition. Annalisa's once peaceful bedroom became a battleground. The walls, once adorned with crucifixes and images of saints, now bore the marks of her desperate struggle. Annalisa's world, once filled with the promise of a bright future, had been plunged into a terrifying abyss. With medical science failing to provide any relief, Annalisa's parents turned to their last resort, the Catholic Church. They believed, with unwavering conviction, that their daughter was in the clutches of something evil, something beyond the realm of human understanding. They reached out to their local priest, a kind and gentle man who had known Annalisa since she was a child. But even he, a man of God, was hesitant to believe their claims of demonic possession. Finally, after months of searching, they found two priests, Father Ernst Alt and Father Arnold Renz, who were willing to listen without judgment. Father Alt, a man of stern demeanor and unwavering faith, had a reputation for his knowledge of ancient rituals and his unflinching resolve in the face of evil. Father Renz, younger and more compassionate, possessed a deep understanding of human suffering and an unshakable belief in the power of prayer. Together they formed a formidable duo, their strengths complementing each other perfectly. They understood the gravity of the task before them, the very real danger posed by the entities they were about to confront. The bishop finally granted his approval, though not without reservations. The first exorcism took place in a small room, the air thick with incense and anticipation. Annalisa, her once vibrant eyes now hollowed by suffering, sat rigidly on a chair, her body restrained by leather straps. Father Alt, his voice booming with authority, began the ancient rite. He invoked the name of God, demanding the demons to identify themselves, to release their hold on the young woman's soul. At first, there was silence. Then, a low growl emanated from Annalisa, growing steadily louder, more menacing. The battle had begun. The demons, angered by the priest's intrusion, unleashed their fury upon the room. Objects flew across the room with impossible force, smashing against the walls. Annalisa writhed in agony, her screams echoing the torment that raged within her. Father Alt, his voice unwavering, continued to recite the ancient rites. Father Wren sprinkled holy water on Annalisa, the blessed liquid sizzling like acid upon contact with her skin. The first encounter had only served to reveal the true nature of the enemy they faced. Ancient, powerful, and utterly ruthless. The exorcisms continued week after week, each session a brutal confrontation between the forces of light and darkness. Annalisa's condition, far from improving, deteriorated at an alarming rate. Her body, once healthy and vibrant, was now a ravaged battleground. She refused food, claiming the demons wouldn't allow her to eat. Her once healthy frame wasted away, her skin stretched taut over protruding bones. The demons, it seemed, were relentless in their torment, determined to break her body and spirit. Annalisa's once peaceful bedroom became a prison, a place of fear and suffering. The walls, once adorned with crucifixes and religious icons, were now bare, stripped clean by her own hand in a desperate attempt to silence the voices that taunted her from every corner. She saw things, horrible things, lurking in the shadows. Demons, their eyes glowing with malevolent glee, leered at her from the darkness. The air in the room was heavy with the stench of sulfur, a constant reminder of the demonic presence that had invaded her sanctuary. Her faith, once unshakable, was being tested to its very core. As the exorcisms continued, Annalisa's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She would lapse into periods of lucidity, her voice regaining its former sweetness, her eyes filled with a heartbreaking vulnerability. She spoke of her torment, of the constant battle raging within her soul. She begged for forgiveness, for release from the nightmare that had engulfed her. But these moments of clarity were fleeting, soon replaced by renewed onslaughts of demonic rage. Those who witnessed these transformations were left shaken to their core, their faith tested by the sheer intensity of the evil they witnessed. Throughout this ordeal, Annalisa's parents remained steadfast in their belief that their daughter was possessed, that only through exorcism could she be freed from the grip of the entities that tormented her. Anna Michel, Annalisa's mother, bore the brunt of her daughter's suffering. She cared for her tirelessly, comforting her during her moments of lucidity and praying by her bedside late into the night. She witnessed firsthand the toll the exorcisms were taking on her daughter's body and mind. Anna's love for her daughter was unwavering, a testament to the enduring power of the maternal bond. By the spring of 1976, a palpable sense of dread had settled over the Michel household. Annalisa, her body ravaged by months of relentless torment, was but a shadow of her former self. The once vibrant young woman was now skeletal, her skin stretched taut over protruding bones, her eyes hollowed out by suffering. The exorcisms, once a beacon of hope, had become a gruesome spectacle. Father Alt and Father Renz, their faces etched with fatigue and a growing sense of despair, continued their grim duty. The demons boasted of their power, their intention to claim Annalisa's soul for their own, to drag her down into the abyss. Section 2. The Price of Faith. Annaliese's parents, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion, clung to their faith as a drowning man clings to a lifeline. They believed with unwavering conviction that their daughter's suffering was a test from God, a trial by fire that she had to endure in order to find salvation. They refused to consider medical intervention, believing it would only serve to anger the demons, to prolong Annaliese's torment. They placed their trust in the church, in the power of the exorcisms to drive out the evil that had taken root in their daughter's soul. But as Annaliese's condition worsened, their resolve began to waver. The weight of their decision, the knowledge that they were responsible for their daughter's well-being, pressed down on them with crushing force. They questioned their faith, their judgment, their sanity. Was this truly the will of God? Or had they, in their desperation, condemned their daughter to a slow and agonizing death? The guilt gnawed at their consciences, a heavy burden they carried alongside their grief. Section 3. A Life Extinguished. On the 1st of July 1976, Anneliese Michel drew her last breath. Her tortured body, finally succumbing to the relentless assault, found peace in death. The silence that descended upon the Michel household was deafening, a stark contrast to the screams and prayers that had filled the air for months. Annaliese's parents, their faces etched with grief and a profound sense of loss, knelt beside her bed, their hands clasped in silent prayer. Their daughter, their little girl, was gone. Taken from them by a force they couldn't comprehend, couldn't control. Father Alt and Father Wren stood by, their heads bowed, their faces pale with shock and exhaustion. They had fought valiantly, had poured all their faith and energy into saving Annaliese's soul. But in the end, it hadn't been enough. The demons, it seemed, had claimed their prize. Or had they? The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. Annaliese's death, a tragedy by any measure, left behind a void, a chilling testament to the power of belief, the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most devout faith. The news of Anneliese Michel's death sent shockwaves through the small German town, reaching a global audience hungry for sensationalism. The story, a chilling blend of faith, superstition, and tragedy, captured the imagination, sparking heated debates about the nature of good and evil. The authorities launched an investigation. Father Alt, Father Renz, and Annaliese's parents were charged with negligent homicide, accused of prioritizing their beliefs over her well-being. The trial captivated the world, revealing disturbing details. In the end, they were found guilty of manslaughter. They were sentenced to probation and suspended jail terms. The question lingered: what had truly killed Anneliese Michel? The quaint cemetery on the outskirts of Klingenberg, Germany, holds a dark secret. Amongst the weathered headstones and moss-covered angels lies a grave that draws the curious and the devout alike. It is the final resting place of Anneliese Michel, a name whispered in hushed tones. Her grave has become a pilgrimage site, adorned with rosaries, flowers, and handwritten pleas. They leave behind tokens of their devotion, their whispered prayers a testament to belief. Annaliese's story, like all good ghost stories, is shrouded in ambiguity. Was she truly possessed, or a victim of misdiagnosed mental illness? The debate rages on, fueled by conflicting narratives of faith and reason. Believers point to documented evidence, skeptics to the lack of concrete proof. Annaliese's story forces us to confront our beliefs and question what we hold to be true. The story of Anneliese Michel is a haunting one. It chills you to the bone, making you question the nature of good and evil. Was Annaliese possessed by demons, or a victim of her troubled mind? There are no easy answers, no neat resolutions to this tale. The human mind is complex, and often terrifying, capable of great love and compassion, but also unimaginable darkness. We seek answers, clinging to beliefs in a chaotic world. Annalisa's story reminds us of the power of belief. It forces us to confront our own vulnerability.